Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. And on Mondays, I film from my house. It is, oh, look at that. Look at my ends. I need to weave in. It's all kinds of raining outside. And I just finished a sweater. Isn't it wonderful? It is not the ranunculus, but it is one of those that I've been talking with a bunch of people at the shop lately about gauge. And the ranunculus was one of those sweaters that you could dive in without testing your gauge because it's so big and open, it'll hopefully just fit everybody. But this is an example of a sweater where I had to test my gauge, and lots of people have been asking about that. And so I'd like to share with you some of my tips about testing gauge to make sure something fits. I mean, let's back up for a second. What is gauge? Gauge is a way to measure what fits in a certain space. And in terms of knitting and crocheting, gauge is important because it's talking about how many stitches and sometimes how many rows. We'll get to that in a second. How many stitches fit into a given standardized space. And the reason it's important is if you want something to come out the same size as the pattern. Now that doesn't matter with every single pattern. If you're making a shawl, if you're making a scarf, if you're making something that if it comes out too big or too small, it's probably okay. You know, that then it becomes personal choice if you want to test gauge before you start. I hardly ever test gauge on a shawl. I just dive in. But if you want something to fit, so the general parameter is if you want it to be the same size as the pattern writer made it. If you want your shawl to be just as big or as small as they wrote it, test your gauge. If it needs to fit, it becomes much more important when you're making a sweater. And it's never completely fail-safe, but it can help a lot more if you test your gauge than if you don't. I really caution people on 99% of sweaters, you need to test your gauge. And there's two reasons for that. I'll go over it. It's on my whiteboard as well. Everybody knits differently or crochets differently. So my gauge, how I hold tension, may not be the same as how you hold tension. On some patterns, it'll be marked as tension. The pattern writer may not have standardized gauge, if that's even a thing, right? And also, not all yarns are created equal, even if they are both called worsted. One could be thinner or thicker than another, and they can behave differently once you knit with them. I'm going to stick to knitting terminology here, but it applies to crochet as well. So it's really important. This sweater that I'm wearing is an example. This is the Wisp Raglan, all my ends, right, by Tif Neilan. And it's gorgeous. It's written for a sport weight. I decided to make it out of a fingering weight plant fiber. So there's a couple things. She made it out of a sport weight merino, and I was making it out of a plant fiber fingering weight. So I knew going in I would need to test my gauge. And I ended up, it was written for the body of this to be knit on a size 8 needle. I knit it on a 6. You'd think if I took it down to a 6, it would be teeny tiny small. It worked for the yarn. You never know. And there's some tricks to think about if your gauge doesn't work, how to shift it so it does. My rule of thumb is change the needle you're knitting with. Do not try to change your tension. I tell my beginning knit and crochet classes about the first sweater I ever made was for my then boyfriend. And I tested my gauge and I got 7 stitches to the inch. Now an inch is a very small measurement to begin with, but I got 7 stitches to the inch and I was supposed to have 7.5. My stitches needed to be smaller. So I just said, I'll knit tighter. I'll pull the yarn tighter and I'll be fine. I didn't want to go buy another needle. I learned the hard way because I didn't know till I was done and took it off the needles because it was on these circular needles. It was a dress on the man and the man was big. So it was huge. His chest hair poked out the top. I learned my lesson. It's really hard, especially over a large garment, to control your tension to something other than what you naturally fall into. What you do have control over is the size of your tools, the girth of your needles. If this isn't working and you need bigger stitches, try again with a bigger needle. Now, I have heard the argument of why bother testing your gauge? It takes time, it takes effort. I just want to start my project. That's a personal decision over, do you want to waste the time? Do you want to take the time at the beginning to test your gauge? And I know it takes time, especially if you want to start your project. Or do you want to just dive in and make it and think of all the time it would take to make something like this and find out it doesn't fit? Again, every once in a while you can test your gauge and it still won't fit in the end. And that could be the pattern. There could be a lot of reasons for that. But let's go over what I tell my students when I'm trying to communicate to them what to do for a gauge swatch. Let's get to it. So let's review the basics, some of what I was just saying when I was on camera. Why a gauge swatch is important. It's important to test your gauge if you want your piece to be the same size as the pattern. Now, as I mentioned before, that's important if you want something to fit. So hats, sweaters, especially the sweaters. Sometimes hats you can get away with it. Socks you can get away with it, things like that. But I find especially for sweaters, for things, it needs to fit your torso and either not be too loose or too tight. A gauge swatch is really important. Making a small piece that you can measure and see if your gauge is right. So as I mentioned before, everyone knits differently. Everybody is looser or tighter than someone else. If you know you knit looser than a lot of other people, you may need to change your needle size. I know I'm a looser crocheter than many, so most patterns, if I test my crochet gauge, I need to go down a few hook sizes just to start. And so everyone knits differently. All yarns are not the same, even if advertised as the same thickness. So if you substitute a yarn, and 9 times out of 10, it's almost impossible to knit it in the same yarn the pattern was written for. Sometimes you can. Even then, you might knit differently than the pattern writer. But all yarns are not the same. Or if you decide to change thickness, like I did with the sweater I'm wearing, you want to test your gauge to make sure it will behave the way the pattern writer wants it to. As I mentioned in the intro, gauge is how many stitches fit into a certain measurement, a certain space. So you'll often find it listed on a pattern. Let's move this up a little bit. You'll often find it listed on a pattern as so many stitches. I have X there. Let's use some algebra here. So many stitches by so many rows will be either 4 by 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters. And whenever people in the US say 4 inches is a weird measurement to pick, it's because whoever came up with this idea was probably using the metric system, and 10 centimeters is a nice round number. Now, 1 inch is a pretty small space to be measuring stitches, and you might find a different measurement in different areas. So a slightly larger space to measure is often a good idea, even if a pattern says so many stitches per inch. 1 inch in one area of your sweater versus another can be very different often. Consistent stitches, it's awesome if you have it. I don't find that many people have it. So you're looking over a bigger picture. So here's my advice on what to do if you're making a gauge swatch. Cast on more stitches than what they advise. So if they say you should have 20 stitches by 25 rows equaling 4 inches, I don't advise casting on 20 stitches. I advise casting on 30. The reason is, again, and also here it says if you have time, knit more rows. The reason is those edge stitches, if you're going to make a square and you're hoping it'll come out just exactly the right size, these edge stitches, they're called selvage. they will curl under. They won't lie flat. They won't be a good measurement. You want to measure in the center somewhere rather than something that needs the edges. Your cast on can be different than your general knitting for the rest of your garment. Your bind off can be different. You want to measure in the center. So if you can, make something that is bigger than 4 by 4 inches. I put right here, your edge stitches will curl and pull and throw your measurement off. And before we get to how to change it and how to fix it, oftentimes when it says so many stitches by so many rows, it's almost impossible to get both of them. You might get the right number of stitches, but not the right number of rows, or vice versa. And you'll find all different methods of how to fix this online. I'm a firm believer in pick one of them to be correct. You can often alter the other one. And which is more important, the stitches or the rows, if one of them is incorrect? Depends on what you're making. But I find if you're doing a traditional knitting straight down on something, especially a sweater, where your stitches are the things that go across and your rows are the things that provide length, more often than not, the stitches are more important. An incorrect number of row gauge can still throw some things off, but not as much as stitches. Because if you think about it, usually the place where something is not going to fit correctly is going to be how it fits around your torso, the width of it. And that is determined by how many stitches. If your stitch gauge is incorrect, it's either going to be huge or it's going to be teeny tiny. If your row gauge is incorrect, you might have some gappiness in here or tightness in there, but oftentimes a pattern will say knit until it's a certain length, and you can just keep going on that. In most traditional clothing, I would much rather have my stitch count be accurate than my row count. Now, an exception is if you're actually knitting if you're knitting sideways, and then your row gauge is going to actually be what determines the width. But don't let that confuse you. If you're doing a classic top-down sweater, I would want to make sure your stitches are correct. Or you have to do something we like to call magic math at the shop. This is not a video on magic math, but I can do one of those later if you want. If your gauge is incorrect, but you still want to use those needles, that's a different video. We'll talk about that another time. So let's take a look at my drawn swatch here. And if we're doing a stockinette swatch, you're going to want to knit a row and purl a row if you're knitting it flat to get stockinette. Now, you will see patterns that are knit in the round, and they will say you should do your swatch in the round. We can address that in a separate video. For now, this is about a flat gauge swatch. So, I don't want to cover too many things in one video. We'll see if we can update and make more bite-sized pieces. So this is my drawn gauge swatch that is bigger than 4 by 4. Knitting a row and purling a row makes all the V's on one side, and that's what we're looking for. My rule of thumb to figure out how many stitches are fitting in our 4 inches is look for the V's. They will be 2 strands. So like if I pick one in the middle, there'll be 2 strands that form what looks like a little V or a little heart. And then how many of those fit into 4 inches? So if you have one of these guys, if you have a ruler, that's fantastic, or a tape measure. I often find something flat and firm is better. Lay your piece out and put something flat and firm over it to measure. Sometimes a floppy tape measure, even like the wrist ruler I'm wearing, can be hard to gauge what is a whole stitch or a half stitch. One of my favorites, and we'll use this with the yarn, one of my favorites is this little guy, the Susan Bates Knit Check. It's only going to have a window that has 2 inches by 2 inches. But let's try, even on my drawing. It might be a little harder to see because I made this drawing really big, but I've got 1 V. Line it up with the edge of one of your V's. 1 V, a second V. Looks like a third V. Again, if it's not straight, we might need to find another spot. I think I see three V's in this little 2-inch window. I can use the bottom of this where there's a good 4 inches and count my V's. I've got 1, let's color code them as I go. 2, here's a 3rd, 4, 5. There's my 4 mark right there. I believe I've got just about 6 stitches in 4 inches. And notice I didn't measure over here, and I've got a little excess over there. Finish filling them in. Now, how about if I needed to count rows? Now, rows can be challenging because we have the part that dips down and the part that rises up, a whole bump. So sometimes I'll go in the middle of a V to try to measure my rows. And this, I didn't make my swatch long enough, honestly, because I'm going to be counting a bottom one. And I don't really, if I was doing it with yarn, I would try to make it taller. So if we go from the bottom tip down here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that 8th one goes a little, if we're going from bottom to top, it might only be, see, the top of this little guy is way up here above the 4 inches. So it might actually be more like 7.5. Rows are a little harder to manage sometimes when you're measuring your gauge. So what I just figured out, let's write it in. We have 6 stitches by, I'm going to say 7.5 rows. Oftentimes rows are shorter than stitches are wide. You'll find it's not exactly a perfect square, which is what makes sometimes making a Fair Isle pattern on graph paper come out a little funky. So here's the thing. Which way to go? If your gauge is not correct, which way do you need to go with your needles? Do you need to go up or down? This throws a lot of people off. And the question to answer is, do we need to fit more stitches or fewer stitches into the same space? Think about a firm set space and we have stitches occupying them, and do we need fewer stitches or more stitches? The problem is most people's brains go, okay, we need more stitches. More sounds like bigger, so I need a bigger needle. That is incorrect. Let's look at it. Or they say, I need fewer stitches. Fewer is smaller, so I need a smaller needle. We need to reverse that thinking, because it's not that bigger means bigger needle. A bigger number of stitches actually means we need more stitches to fit into the same space. So let's take a look at this. I've got 3 boxes. Here is the gauge I got on my first get-go. It's 7 stitches are fitting into this box. And see how big they are. So let's make these guys red. Okay, my red stitches. I have 7 of them. Let's say what's required by the pattern. Let's look at 2 examples. Let's say the pattern actually wanted me to have 10 stitches in that same space. Take a look. This is what 10 stitches looks like in the same space as those 7 stitches. Let's try giving them a little bit of color. But what do you notice about them? These 10 stitches, we need more of them. In order to have more stitches in the same amount of space, they need to be smaller. So they need to be smaller. So you need a smaller needle. If more stitches need to fit in the same space, they need to be smaller stitches. So we need to go down a needle size or 2 or 3. You get to decide how many times do you need to remake it. Let's say on the flip side, we needed only 5 stitches. Now that's what 5 stitches looks like in the same space as opposed to 7. As you can see, they're much bigger. So we need fewer stitches in the same space. They need to be bigger. So we need a bigger needle. That's the way to think about it. Not so much try to avoid the trap of more stitches. That's a bigger number of stitches, so I need a bigger needle. If you need more stitches for gauge, they actually need to be teeny tinier stitches to get more of them in the same space. And the converse is true. If you need fewer stitches, don't think fewer is a smaller number, so I need a smaller needle. Think fewer stitches in the same space means they need to grow. They need to be bigger stitches to occupy the same space. So I need a bigger needle. Sometimes you have to think the whole thing through. So let's try a gauge swatch with this yarn that I'm currently doing a cardigan with. Since I don't have a pattern, let's just test to see if I can get the same gauge as the ball band says. So a lot of ball bands will have a funky looking square right there and needles and hooks. They may list it with words, they may have it with pictures. They're saying the average knitter using a US 9 needle should get a gauge of 17 stitches by 25 rows to give them the tension or the gauge of 10 centimeters, 4 inches square. So 17. That means I want to cast on more than that. I don't want to try to have that exact measurement on my needles because remember those edge stitches will totally throw it off. So I'm going to just pull a whole, let me get back to this. Here's my tail. I'm going to get a whole bunch of this going. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to cast on more than 17. I like a lot of buffer. So I'm going to actually cast on a whole 30. So what's on my needle right now will count as 1. I'm just going to cast on a whole bunch. While I'm doing this, I also want to address to block or not block your gauge swatch. Honestly, I don't block mine. I want to make sure that my stitch count will work if I don't have a chance to block my final piece. Some people will adamantly tell you that you should block your gauge swatch. And my caution is if you block it exactly the same way you are going to do your finished piece. Don't aggressively pull it if you're not planning on aggressively pulling your finished piece, because then you will find that it doesn't end up looking the same. So let's see how many I have. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 30. And I'm just peculiar in that I like when I'm doing a stockinette swatch, I like to have my first row be a purl row because I already feel like I have these purl bumps here. So I'm going to go ahead and knit and purl many, many rows. The other thing about if I don't block my gauge swatch is then I often actually, will pull it out and use it in my sweater. So I don't have to buy more yarn than the pattern calls for because I'm not going to keep my gauge swatch as a memento of my arduous journey to find my gauge. So we will see you all once I have knitted several inches, and I'll show you how I measure my gauge. All right, here is my swatch that I've tried to knit at least 4 inches. See, the total thing with my 30 stitches is a good 6 inches. I could have done a few more rows. I'm just over 4 inches right here. The biggest thing, the most important thing is see how these edges are curling. If I'd only cast on my 17 stitches, I could measure and see if it's 4 inches or less or more. I like to have it big enough to measure my 4 inches in the middle. So not the bottom, because the bottom cast on can pull the stitches in actually a little bit more. And notice I didn't even bother to bind it off. but I'm going to try not to measure up near where it is on the needle because that can spread it out. As I mentioned, my favorite go-to is something like the Susan Bates Knit Check. It is not expensive. This little, we bring it in closer, this window is 2 inches by 2 inches. So to measure for the gauge listed on a pattern, oftentimes you can count this and multiply by 2, or you can use the 4 on the outside. I like to absolutely frame my stitches. So remember on the drawing, we're going to look for those V's. And if we can, we're going to look for something really in the middle, not too close to any of the edges. And I try to line it up with those 2 strands of a V. I like the V's pointing down. You might choose to do V's pointing up. And I am boxing in. I'm trying to line up my rows as well, just in case. But if I count these, I like to point to the middle of a V. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And there's a little bit there. So I could even have 9.5. Now remember, the gauge was supposed to be 17 stitches. The ball band implied if I just grabbed a size 9 needle and started knitting with this yarn, I would get 17 stitches. Everybody knits differently. So that math right there implies I might have a good 19 stitches over 4 inches. So I can come down here and check it. I'm going to check in a few places too, because one spot may not be enough. Now, the pink here shows where I should start counting. And the 4 is over here. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and a hair more. I'm at about 18 stitches. I might be at 18.5. Like that in there might not be a full half stitch. It might be a quarter. So in terms of my stitches, I have 18. Let's round down perhaps, or let's 18.5 or 18. Either way, I have too many stitches here. I need fewer stitches. I need them to fill the space. Fewer stitches to fill the exact same space. So if I want to get the stitch count on the ball band, I am going to have to go up a needle size. My stitches right now are too small. I have too many of them, which means they're too small. So for me to get the gauge on the ball band, I'm probably going to have to go up to a 10 and try again. Let's check row gauge. Like I said, I usually can't get both, but let's see what's going on. For this, I may move into the middle of a V, and I'm going to start at the bottom corner. So this little guy there doesn't count. It's this V that's full. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That 13, not this little guy up here, but this one that goes full bottom to top. There's a full one in the window. 13, multiply that by 2, that's 26. And that also is too many. It's supposed to be 25 using this needle. So again, if I go up to a 10, I might hit both benchmarks. It's hard to say. To get everything bigger, I need bigger stitches. I need fewer stitches, which means they need to be bigger. I'm not going to do that right now, but that's the thinking I would employ to try again. So thanks for joining us to talk about gauge swatching. And just to give you an idea of some math and how even if we go down to the inch, you might say, I'm only off by maybe a half a stitch. Now a half a stitch over 4 inches, maybe not so bad. But think about if you break down the math, what I call magic math is if you want to test how much your gauge is off by and if it will affect the overall size of what you're making. Let's take something with nice round numbers. So I'm supposed to have 5 stitches per inch. If we break it down to something that might make a little more sense in the head, that's 20 stitches over 4 inches. So my gauge is supposed to be 20. and that means 5 stitches per inch. Okay. Let's say instead you got 4 stitches per inch. You get a gauge of 16 rather than 20. That sounds pretty huge, right? Let's see what would happen if, say, the torso of a sweater, spot right in here, you had 200 stitches. If you divide that by 5 stitches per inch, you have a torso that's 40 inches. 200 divided by 5, we have 40 inches. So let's say that your stitch gauge was actually 4 stitches per inch, 16 stitches instead of 20. That's noticeable. So it's like, okay, it's probably going to throw it off some. If we divide that 200 by 4 instead of by 5, we've got 50 inches around instead of 40 inches around. So all of a sudden you've gained 10 inches on the torso of your sweater. That's going to be a lot bigger. Let's say per inch, if we were only measuring over an inch, you had 4.5 stitches, 4.5 stitches rather than 5. Okay, that's only half a stitch. That's what I did with the sweater for my boyfriend. Is I said it's only half a stitch. I can add that in, I can make that up, whatever. Something that instead of being 5 stitches per inch is 4.5 stitches per inch, you're still going to gain 5 inches on the torso of that. That's still 5 inches. That's 5 inches. Your torso is going to be that much bigger. It can make a difference. Honestly, it's often worth the time it takes to test your gauge again on a different needle to see if you can get gauge on a different needle. Future issues are if you don't like the way the fabric you're creating by your knitting is feeling on the different size needle. That's a whole nother thing to deal with. If your stitches are too tight or too loose, you might want to change your yarn, or you may need to do some magic math on recalculating which size you want to make for how it's going to come out. But even that is not a magic solution because there's issues of length that go along with changing sizes. We could go off, but not for this video. Thank you so much for joining us for this today. I hope this helps if you're about to test your gauge for something you are making. I really find if it's your first sweater or your 20th, it can be really beneficial to test your gauge, to make sure your stitch count is coming out correctly or as close as you can to what the gauge should be for your sweater. There are many ways you can support this channel. If you have enjoyed what you have learned today, you can subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. There's no cost in that. You can click the bell for notifications. You can at least give this video a thumbs up. If you'd like to support monetarily the work that we're doing here at Sundragon, it is not required, but it's always appreciated. You can go to patreon.com/sundragon and sign up for a monthly fee there. You can get some swag out of it. You can become a member here. There are different levels for that. You can give us a super thanks. It's kind of like giving us a tip. It's all good. Regardless, thank you for watching, and may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. We'll see you later. Bye-bye. You in my seat? That's my seat. I guess it's your seat today. That's okay.